Hello and welcome to another episode of Let's Talk, exploring the issues affecting all of our lives. I'm your host, Austin Harris. Today, it is our distinct pleasure to host a leading Caribbean economist who is noted for her insightful analysis on the economies that make up the wider Caribbean and the implications of geopolitics on the region. As such, she is a highly sought-after speaker at key industry conferences, both regionally and internationally, and says what drives her commitment is a desire to truly make a difference to Caribbean countries and its people. It is truly a pleasure to welcome to Let's Talk our guest, Ms Marla Dukharan. Marla, thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me, Austin. I'm really grateful for this opportunity to share my thoughts and ideas and sometimes my unpopular opinions with you and your special viewers in Cayman, which is, of course, one of my favorite places on earth. So thank you so much for having me.
It's a real pleasure, and we must have you back in the island soon. Marla, many of us look forward to your Caribbean Economic Report and your analysis of economies in the region. I particularly enjoy your fearless nature in taking some Caribbean leaders to task on their policies, and especially the European Union as it relates to some of their, some say, one-sided blacklisting policies that unfairly target small island states like our own. Hopefully, in today's discussion, we can touch on some of these.
Absolutely. As you say, one-sided, but maybe one-colored. But anyway, we'll get to that later.
Indeed. Well, let's talk. Very few conference speakers insert Bob Marley quotes in their speeches, or even title economic lectures, "Inflation targeting is the best thing since ackee and codfish." Your love for the region and economics is obvious. For the benefit of our viewers, maybe you can tell us what got you excited about economics in the first place and what keeps you enthusiastic about that topic.
Well, Austin, the story goes way back in terms of how I got into economics. And basically, when I started doing A-levels, and, you have to choose which subjects you're going to do, my plan was to do, among others, French. But French was clashing with math. And so the school said, maybe you should try economics. Because it was either that or something like geography or history, which I have no interest in. And of course, I didn't think I had an interest in economics either, but it seemed like the lesser of all the evils because there was math in it. So signed up for economics, got this huge, almost like a telephone directory when those existed, huge macroeconomics textbook authored by a gentleman called John Beardshaw. And I remember opening this book, which I still have back at home in Trinidad in my parents' house in the library, I hope. Opened this textbook, and it's as though the heavens open and angels sang hallelujah, and bright lights appeared, and it was everything in this book to me made sense, and it felt like going home. It felt like, and I literally, I kid you not, fell in love, and it's been a wonderful journey ever since. I won't tell you how long ago that was, but it was a long time ago. And that's when I knew at that moment that this is what I would be spending my life doing. One of the musical lyrics I quote often, it's a song maybe a year or two ago done by DJ Khaled and Buju Banton and Bounty Killer. It's a masterpiece. It's Where You Come From. I'm from the West Indies, right? So West Indian music is always in my head. Maybe I'm Jamaican, born on Dukharan Avenue in Kingston. I don't know, but yeah. And I mean, Bob Marley, come on, there's no greater than him. Okay. I often hear him. I often hear David Rudder, Bunji Garlin, and sometimes even Sean Paul, because I often look up to the Lord and say, just give me the light, right? And lately when I think of my country, which is, almost every waking moment, the song that comes in my head, which I don't know, I don't know if you ever heard of an artist called Skillibang. He has a song called Wap Wap.
Mm-hmm.
which is really gunshots, you know.
Yeah.
I only heard it because my son said, "Mommy, did you hear this amazing song?" And I'm listening to the song like, "What is that?" But then when you realize, yeah, this is where my country, which I know you all have this love for country music and Cayman, but that's one genre that I never fell in love with, except for Dolly Parton's Jolene. Yes. And I mean, in this region, and you asked about, you know, my coverage of this region and why do I do what I do and how do I keep doing it? The thing about it is I'm always in awe of just how beautiful this region is and how beautiful our people are. We are so warm, so resilient. I think we are the most resourceful people on the planet, especially given the suffering that when you think about the kind of suffering that our people have endured and still endure, even, you know, when you go to Haiti and Cuba, countries that are under all kinds of duress, they are the warmest people you could ever meet. And so that's one reason I do what I do, just for my love of the people in this region. But also, this is an exciting region to cover. I mean, there's never a dull moment. There's always some bacchanal with a snap election over here, a sovereign default over there, a premier being arrested, a former central bank governor or minister of finance gone missing and still hasn't been found. I mean, where else would you find this kind of activity? And I think it's partly because I haven't measured it, but I think we have too many politicians. And I think on a per capita basis, we probably have more politicians per capita than anywhere else on earth. So that makes it very exciting. So I never get bored covering this region. So that's another reason why I continue to do what I do.
Well, an American economist, Thomas Sowell, once noted, and I quote, "The first lesson in economics is scarcity. There's never enough of anything to fully satisfy those who want it. The first lesson in politics is to disregard the first lesson of economics." Why is sound economic management important, and how well have we done in the Caribbean, including the Cayman Islands, in managing our economies?
That's a really good question. I've often said the Cayman Islands is the best run economy in the region. And of course, other people from other countries have taken me to task for that, but we will get into that maybe another day. And the reason is simple. And there are two things that I want you to take away from this conversation, you and your viewers, as to how our economies work and what works and what doesn't. In the first place, the first point I want to make, which, don't ever forget this, because governments will try, or I should say politicians will try to convince you otherwise. But government spending does not create sustainable growth in this region. That whole equation of how you measure GDP, C plus G plus I plus X minus M, sorry, I don't mean to frighten anybody, but it just means consumption plus investment plus government spending plus exports minus imports is equal to GDP. So if you increase government spending, one would assume that because it's got a positive sign in front of it, then higher government spending means higher GDP. The problem is that equation does not work for our economies in this region. And most of the economics that I was taught and most policymakers are taught is really economics that's relevant for the advanced economies, not relevant for us. Because that G for government spending has a positive sign in front of it. But when 80 to 90% of what we consume and what the government spends on really ends up in imports, then increasing G is not increasing our GDP. It's increasing the GDP of the countries that you are importing from. So when the government spends more, whether it's on wages, whether it's on goods and services, most of that ends up in imports. So increasing government spending does not create growth, and it does not sustainably create jobs. So that's the first thing that we need to remember. And the second thing we need to remember is that the private sector, only the private sector-led growth is sustainable in the Caribbean. And so the real drivers of growth in this region are, remember that equation, the real drivers are actually investment and exports. Those are the only two real drivers of growth. Governments don't export, private sector does. And the government can invest. They certainly do with their public sector investment program, for example, in terms of infrastructure. And that is what we need the government to do. We need governments to create an environment that's stable, create ease of doing business. Basically, we need them to pave the road and then get out of the way. That's what we really need. And regulate it. Regulate the road, put the traffic signs, and then get out of the way. And the other key role that a government should play is that, apart from being an enabler, is that of an enterprise risk manager. So when governments exercise fiscal prudence, they can build buffers so that when a crisis occurs, as they want to do, then we have something to draw on so that they can protect and preserve stability. And the Cayman Islands government has done a great job of adhering to the fiscal frameworks in place, not overspending and overborrowing as many of us do in this region. And luckily, you guys had, over 600 million, if memory serves me correct, set aside from fiscal surpluses having been accumulated over the years, set aside just before the pandemic. And so those funds were able to be deployed to maintain stability and to protect the most vulnerable. But this approach is really not universal in this region. There are a few countries that engage in this kind of pattern of spending. Most countries engage in what, in my world, we call pro-cyclical fiscal policy, which is when you earn more revenue, you spend more. And then when revenue collapses, like when there is a crisis, you spend less, or you continue spending at the level that you normally would, but that differential is now borrowed, and then you rack up debt. What really you should do is when revenue is buoyant, you save some, so that when, the Cayman Islands government had done prior to the pandemic, so that when revenue declines, you have something to draw on, so that it kind of smooths out fiscal spending over time, which then leads to a more stable economy. And this is what we need in every country in this region. And this is one of the things that's lacking. And that's why, I keep saying that the Cayman Islands is one of the best run countries in the region.
Thank you for that. And certainly when we talk about the economies of small island states like ourselves, as you may know, we recently had a general election about a year ago. Certainly the previous administration practiced fiscal prudence, no new borrowing, and that led to the substantial surpluses. The new administration taking perhaps a different tact, a bit of a spending spree, and whilst we have warned about where that can end up, it remains to be seen where it does end up in the near future. Now, many small Caribbean countries, including the Cayman Islands, are dependent on tourism and financial services as their key pillars of their economies. In recent years, you have spoken out against the discriminatory way you view the European Union's blacklisting agenda. Indeed, you refer to it as, I quote, institutionalized racism and bullying. What is driving blacklisting in your view, and what is the problem that is causing?
Before I explain what problems it's causing and what's driving it, let me just step back a little bit and explain these two lists that the EU produces. So you have one blacklist that the EU produces that looks at, in their view, countries that are not tax compliant with international tax standards. So that's the tax blacklist. And then you have another list that looks at countries that are, in their view, not compliant with international anti-money laundering and combating the financing of terrorism standards. So it's two lists, right? Not one blacklist that the EU produces. And by the way, the EU is not the global authority on these matters. The OECD, because countries are signatory to their oversight of tax administration and tax matters globally, the OECD is recognized as the authority, and that's by consent. Okay, so countries sign on to have this oversight and adherence to OECD tax standards, and then you have the FATF, and again, countries sign on to comply with the FATF's AML and CFT standards. So again, it's by consent. And that's a very important element to remember, that countries agree to adhere to these standards. In the EU, however, there is no question asked, can you adhere to these standards? The EU woke up one day and decided they're going to assess countries based on their methodology that they invented, and they're going to assess these countries to determine on a unilateral basis whether or not these countries are compliant. And when you are deemed to be compliant or uncompliant, non-compliant, they put you on the list, this blacklist. The problem is they don't assess, first of all, their methodology. When I don't want to bore your listeners and viewers to go into the details of the methodology. But first of all, they come up with a methodology where they say, when we come to assess different countries, we can decide whether or not we apply this methodology to them. So that's the first thing. The methodology is disposable. The second thing is they decide whether or not to apply this methodology based on the significance of a particular country to the European Union. So if you are insignificant to the European Union, you are more likely to be blacklisted, whether or not you're compliant. And then the third thing about their methodology is that not only do they look at what the FATF and OECD do and determine, okay, so countries that are not compliant or not fully compliant with the OECD and FATF, they screen those countries more closely. But also, even when the OECD and the FATF have decided, okay, I used to have you on a list, but you now complied, and so I take you off the list of non-compliant countries, the EU does not necessarily revise their list based on the OECD and the FATF revising their list. So their methodology says they look at what the OECD and the FATF do, but they can choose when to follow what the OECD and FATF have listed, and they choose when not to. So it's very unfair the way that they apply this methodology, which is disposable in the first place. And I feel like it's quite the bureaucratic and statistical feat that the European Union was able to concoct this methodology that was so complex and so sophisticated and so precise, and ultimately so effective in achieving their truly unstated but obvious intent, is that they produce not one, but two blacklists where not one single country is a predominantly white country. Not one.
Yes.
And the nomenclature of the list is also spot on, right? We call it blacklist. Why? Because there are no white countries on these blacklists.
Indeed.
Now, when you look at the countries that are on the list, we account for less than 2% of global tax losses, global money laundering, and global terrorism financing. And the EU and their allies account for the remaining 98%. EU members of parliament have highlighted the fact that jurisdictions currently on the EU tax haven blacklist account for less than 2% of worldwide tax revenue losses, and that EU member states themselves are responsible for 36% of tax havens. EU members of parliament further called the EU's list of tax havens confusing and inefficient, and stated, and I quote, "While the list can be a good tool, member states forgot something when composing it: actual tax havens," unquote. Furthermore, EU blacklisted countries account for less than 1% of humans alive today and produce under 1.1% of global GDP. So the chances are we are not the real problem. They are.
Thank you, Marla, certainly for that stark realization as it relates to global tax and who really is to blame in this whole equation. Just for the benefit of our listening audience, perhaps you can explain the terms FATF, OECD to our audiences as to what that really means.
Sure. So the OECD is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Really, it's an organization of some of the most advanced economies in the world. So the Caribbean, we are not members of the OECD, but for most of us, we are signatories to their tax oversight and tax standard adherence. FATF is the Financial Action Task Force, which is the global money laundering and terrorist financing watchdog. It's an intergovernmental body that sets standards that aim to prevent money laundering and terrorism financing and the harm that they cause to society. And this both according to their websites.
The World Bank estimates that pre-pandemic levels of output will be protracted for much of the Caribbean region in 2022. GDP, we touched on earlier on, is expected to be 1.5% below what it was in 2019. Meanwhile, inflation and interest rates continue to rise in economies that truly have not fully recovered since the pandemic. I'm trying to find a silver lining to close out our conversation, but I can't really find any. I wonder, is there a rainbow at the end of this storm from your vantage point?
Well, Austin, I think you touched on something important there. You said at the end of the storm. I don't know if you've realized, but we've been looking from one crisis to another.
Yeah.
We had the pandemic starting in early 2020 here in Barbados and in the EC Islands. We had Hurricane Elsa last year. We had La Soufriere volcano. And now we have this global inflationary pressure coming as a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Who knows? The imagination is limitless as to what could be the next crisis, right? I think that it's important not to think about, is there a silver lining at the end of this current crisis? I think what we need to really think about is, how do we manage in crisis situations? Because more and more, that's our reality. Okay? And I feel like to deny it or to wish that it ends and to live life as though it's going to go away at some point, maybe that's a risk manager in me, but I feel like you're doing yourself a disservice if you take that kind of approach. I think the approach we need to take is to imagine that there will always be some sort of crisis, some sort of pressure, especially in this region. When you look at the fact that climate change is causing not just more hurricanes and more severe hurricanes, it's causing, for example, less intense but no less damaging problems for us, such as coastal erosion. I'm seeing it. I mean, I live on the coast here in Barbados, and you see it. You see the massive, piles of seaweed. I'm not joking. As tall as me. I'm not that tall, but still, piles of seaweed lining the beach, 5 feet high. And that affects not just your tourism industry, but it affects the people who live there and the fishermen and the people who rely on the marine resources for a living. So we are going to face pressures from different angles all the time. So we need to adopt a mindset of, how do we learn to thrive when we're under pressure? How do we build buffers so that when we have to find the revenue or the resources to spend towards recovery, we have something there? How do we ensure against these catastrophes taking place? Because, for example, the IMF did some research years ago that found that 20 years after an average storm hits, and an average storm, they're looking at like a category 3 hurricane. 20 years after an average storm hits, you're still seeing the effects in the data in the socioeconomic data, they can still find the effects. Can you imagine this pandemic? How long we're going to be able to see this in the data? Can you imagine this crisis with the inflation that we're facing? How long we're going to see? And then there will be storms. There will always be storms. We already had one, for the season already. And so the silver lining is up to us. We have to create it in the sense that we have to change our mindsets. Our policymakers have to change their mindsets and their policy agenda. It's as though we have to set ourselves up for perpetual crises and managing and mitigating these perpetual crises. That's how I believe. And another thing that I feel like policymakers, and not just in this region, but globally, don't necessarily understand from a policy perspective and think about from a policy perspective what needs to be done, is population decline. Population aging and then population decline. We're used to planning and thinking about growing and growing and growing and GDP getting bigger and bigger. But when you have population shrinking, which is not necessarily a bad thing because the world cannot support an ever increasing population. It's already struggling with the population we already have. How do you plan for 50 years in your country down the line, or even 20 years for a smaller population? And these are the kinds of things I think policymakers really need to be thinking about and not get stuck in the mindset of where we used to be. It's a whole paradigm shift. It's a whole revolution in the way we should be thinking about our future and planning for it. And I'm not sure, when I speak to policymakers in this region, I'm not sure that that's where their heads are. And so one of the things, I would like more countries to look at and think about is, instead of measuring GDP and being obsessed with growing GDP, what about thinking about gross national happiness? I don't know if you've ever heard of gross national happiness. There's one country on earth called Bhutan, where they started measuring gross national happiness some years ago based on their king declaring that GDP is too narrow and too weak a measure and doesn't capture enough of what is important. And gross national happiness places emphasis on 9 metrics of collective happiness and sustainability: psychological well-being, health, education, time use, cultural diversity and resilience, good governance, community vitality, ecological diversity and resilience, and living standards. And think about it. If policymakers would place emphasis on those 9 metrics, that is a recipe for success, as opposed to that obsession with GDP growth, and it won't be as high as it was in 2019 and so on. That's just placing emphasis, in my view, on the wrong ideas and the wrong things. And I think the Cayman Islands should be the second country on earth to measure gross national happiness. You certainly have the resources to do it. And maybe the next time you have me on your show, we can talk a little bit more about gross national happiness. But again, I think that people in the Cayman Islands don't realize how lucky they are and how successful, a country Cayman is. I think one of the most important strengths you have as a nation is your diversity in terms of your ethnicity and your nationalities. And don't for a moment underrate how important this is in Cayman's resilience and success. And in terms of policy changes, I think gross national happiness, a sovereign wealth fund, which I've talked about publicly a few times, but I think de-emphasizing this obsession with GDP growth is something that all of us need in this region. And I think that's our silver lining, changing our mindsets to focus on what really matters.
You mentioned that the advanced economies could, in fact, ease economic pressures through greater direct inward investment. Talk to us a little bit about how that direct inward investment could be deployed.
One of the things that the advanced economies can really help us with is making sure that the world's largest polluters fund the US $2.5 trillion needed to save our homes and our lives in the Caribbean and others on the front lines of climate change. West Indians suffer losses of countless lives and livelihoods and physical damage to our economies 2 to 3 times the size of our economy in some cases, while we account for less than 1% of global emissions. And so many small island developing states, and of course, Prime Minister Mia Mottley has been on the forefront of this, appealing to the most developed nations, which are, by the way, the largest polluters, to find the resources to help finance this $2.5 trillion we need to finance climate adaptation. And so let me just read for you here. It says that, basically they said that keeping temperature increases below 2 degrees Celsius versus pre-industrial levels means bringing net greenhouse gas emissions to 0 by 2050. That costs money. And global estimates of the investment needed for that energy transition ranges from $2.5 trillion to $4 trillion per year. And you think, well, okay, that's a huge amount of money. But if the G7 central banks, instead of buying $25 trillion of government bonds since 2009 through quantitative easing, instead if they opted to purchase $25 trillion in bonds that finance this green transition, they would have achieved their desired economic impact and gotten halfway to halting climate change. Perhaps coincidentally, the quantitative easers, that is the US, the UK, Eurozone, Japan, are the largest contributors to the global stock of greenhouse gases. And in other words, the world's biggest polluters have demonstrated that they have the funding capacity needed for climate change mitigation in the developing world. And they have not deployed it for that purpose. And that leaves the $2.5 trillion question. If they don't fund it, who will? I think that the international community needs to put pressure on the world's largest polluters to come up with that financing, because they have that financing already and they just need to allocate it better.
Marla, on behalf of all of us here on Let's Talk and our audience, I want to thank you for taking the time out of your very busy schedule to join us. It has been enjoyable, educational, and if I might add, you are probably the hippest economist I've ever met.
Thank you, Austin. I don't deserve all of those compliments, but thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. I'm happy to chat with you anytime.
Thank you so much, and there will definitely be a part 2. And to our audiences, we again say thank you for taking the time to tune in, and hope you enjoyed today's chat and guest as much as we did. Remember to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. If there's a discussion you would like us to present here on Let's Talk, please feel free to leave those suggestions along with any other comments on our YouTube channel. Please tune in every Tuesday and Thursday at 4 p.m. for another episode of Let's Talk, exploring the issues affecting all of our lives. I'm your host, Austin Harris. Until next time.